Sovereignty and stablecoins. That's what we're going to talk about this week on Milkshakes, Markets, and Madness. Sovereignty is a term that I think everybody's familiar with, and everybody kind of knows what it means. But I'm not sure everybody completely understands it. And I'm not sure everybody completely understands why it sits at the heart of everything we talk about on this channel and just about everything that's going on in the world now. Sovereignty sits at the basis of all domestic politics. Sovereignty sits at the basis of all geopolitics. And sovereignty actually sits at the base of the monetary system itself. And this is why I've often said you cannot separate power and money, because they're basically two sides of the same coin. And so what I thought we'd do today is we're going to walk through just some basic terminology that surrounds sovereignty and what it actually means and why it is so important for everything that's going on right now. And so hold on, let me pull up some slides here. Sovereignty, again, it's basically means to have or to possess supreme power or ultimate power. It's the ability to act independently without any outside influence. Now, this is obviously something that we all would like, and to a certain extent, we all strive to get this. As it relates to countries, obviously, a country is going to try to exert its sovereignty over its geographic territory. You as an individual may try to exert your sovereignty over your household or your place of business or your personal space. But the bottom line is there is always a battle for the sovereignty over a space, whether that's a room, whether it's a car, whether it's a country, or whether it's the whole world. But sovereignty really goes down to who has the ultimate power. The name is actually derived from a Latin word, that means above, regarding rulership and control. And so sovereign is basically one who is above rulership or control over another. Again, it's the ability to do basically whatever you want and not to be subject to someone else and to not be a slave. Now, again, I think everybody kind of knows this, but why is this so important for what's going on in the world today? Well, as I said earlier, and as I've said many times on this channel, and the point that I try to pound home as much as I can, is that while money may be something, we might have an idea of what we want money to be, but what is it actually? And what is it in practice? It's another thing to have a great theory that everybody loves. But if that's not what it is in practice, does it really matter? Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't understand the different things that money could be. But I think one of the things, I think everybody would agree, one of the things I try to do as much as possible is to beat home, fantasy versus reality, because the real world is what we're all investing in and what we're all dealing with. And it's important to understand what it is in practice rather than just what it is in theory. And Napoleon, he said, there is only one thing in this world, and that is to keep acquiring money and more money, power and more power. All the rest is meaningless. Now, I'll tell you, on a personal level, I don't necessarily subscribe to this belief. But people like Napoleon do. And people like Napoleon are the ones that run the world. And so if you want to understand what it is that people that run the world are trying to do, it's important to understand where Napoleon or people like Napoleon is coming from. And the reality is the reason Napoleon wanted to acquire more money was because if you acquire more money, you acquire more power, and vice versa. If you acquire more power, you can then acquire more money. And again, it's just really, really hard to separate these two. And I'll come back to this in a little bit. But even if you're not thinking of it from that perspective, let's take Carl Sandburg. He's a little different type of character than Napoleon. But again, money is power because money gives you freedom. It gives you a cushion. And while it may be the root of all evil, it is also the sum of all blessings. So again, it's this double-edged sword. You can't really separate the power that money gives you. You can't separate those two. Money and power are basically inextricably linked. I really don't think that you can separate the two at all. I think there's some people who disagree with me on this, but I think it's really, especially now in today, where certain freedoms are being lost, and power plays are kind of on the global stage more than they have been maybe over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And I think we're entering a period where power, just raw power, becomes more important or is used more decisively than it has been perhaps over the last few decades. And this has huge implications for markets and our portfolios. But the real question here, and that I want everybody to think about, is how can a state or a country or a nation, however you want to define that, how can the state be truly sovereign if it's subject to someone else's money? So in other words, a lot of people will say, even though, the state issues fiat money, which isn't really money, how could if the state used, let's say, gold or Bitcoin or something that they didn't actually control, how could they truly claim to be sovereign? In other words, if the state is beholden to the power of gold or the power of Bitcoin or the power of some other coin or some other asset or some other commodity over which they cannot influence, control, then they are not truly sovereign. And that again goes back to my belief that the two are inseparable, and why you at least have to be open to the idea that if you do believe that the state is sovereign, then you also have to sort of believe that the state gets to decide what money is, because you can't have a state that is a sovereign and is also subservient. Those two just don't go together. And again, we get back to money and power being inextricably linked. We'll come back to this again in a minute as well. And really, what this power ultimately gives, and why sovereignty is so important to a country or an individual, really more on a national level though, or even on the global stage, is seigniorage. And this goes back to power and money. Seigniorage is basically the difference between the value of the currency and the cost of producing it. So it basically costs nothing to print little green pieces of paper, right? The cost of that is very low. But then we can send those, the United States can send those little green pieces of paper or the digitized version of those little green pieces of paper all over the world, and in return get finished goods and get services and get highly valued commodities and products. And the US, because they are the global hegemon and because they are sovereign, they can print global money. Now, other countries have seigniorage within their domestic boundaries, but only one country has seigniorage on the global stage, and that's the United States. And that has created a lot of tension, to put it politely. And it's all of those tensions that are kind of coming to bear now. And this is a big part of all, both the national political and geopolitical problems and conflicts that are coming up right now. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that because the United States has global seigniorage and nobody else does, then those other countries, to a certain extent, are not sovereign. Because while they're sovereign in their own countries, they're not sovereign on the global stage because they are subservient to the Eurodollar market. And the Eurodollar market, which we talk about all the time, is probably the most powerful, I don't know what you want to call it, network or entity, or it is the most powerful thing on the planet. And this is why I often say it is the ultimate weapon, because the Eurodollar market can literally crush countries. Now, interestingly, the US doesn't have full control of the Eurodollar market either. So while on a relative basis, the US has sovereignty versus any other country or any other entity, it doesn't really totally control the Eurodollar market. So in a sense, it is subservient to the Eurodollar market. So even though it has some control and it has better control than anybody else, it doesn't have full control. And I think that bothers the sovereign entity of the United States. And I think they want to try to solve that, because going back to Napoleon's thing, you always want more money and you always want more power. No nation wants less power. So if the United States, even though they are over, they don't have to pay fealty to any other country, they do to a certain extent have to answer to the Eurodollar market. And I think they are doing some things, or trying to do some things, to solve that. So this kind of gets back to what is money. Now, we've talked about this several times, and I've done a whole presentation on this. You can go back and find different presentations that we've given on this, and we've written about it on our research site, and we'll talk about that again in a minute. But man, it comes back to what is money, right? I think the main function of money is to act as a medium of exchange through which one specialist can exchange, their goods with the goods of another specialist. And it enables people to avoid the inconvenience of, walking around and, you've got a goat and you're trying to find a pair of shoes, and somebody has a pair of shoes and they need a goat, right? It solves this double coincidence of wants, and it does away with traditional barter. Not only that, but money is a way to extinguish debt. And I think that's, theoretically, or, in one sense, I don't think that that's wrong. This is actually my favorite definition of money, but I don't know that this is necessarily what money is in practice, because money is also a tool of the king. And this goes back to what we were just talking about. How could the king not have control of the money if he's the sovereign? Now, sometimes throughout history, these two things have been the same thing. Sometimes the market what the market chose as money also happened to be what the king chose as money. But that wasn't always the case. And when it came into conflict, oftentimes the king's decision won out over what the market wanted. And so this is where, we've talked about this before. And I sent this out as kind of a joke today, but there's a little truth in it too. And, when it comes down to it, power, physical power oftentimes overpowers monetary power. And I said, remember when Genghis Khan would roll up on a new city on the steppe and demand fealty, and the city would respond that they didn't like the paper money that Genghis Khan used. And because they didn't like the paper money, Genghis Khan would turn around and go home. No, of course he didn't turn around and go home. He knocked their walls down, went in there, looted their city, burned it to the ground, and kept using his paper money because he was the strongest and his army was the strongest. So even though on a philosophical basis, that might not be, his paper notes might not be the best form of money, he still won. So you kind of have to, have some situational awareness around what is or what isn't, taking place in the world in which you live. And we've used this example before. If you're in prison and the biggest, toughest guys tells you that cigarettes are money, I got to tell you, cigarettes are money. You might want to walk up to him and explain to him why cigarettes aren't really money and that gold is only money. And, you can then spend the next 20 minutes picking your teeth off the ground. But, it gets back to power and money and who has, it's hard to say that the biggest, toughest guy doesn't get to say what money is. Now, you might say that he's just making a money substitute and it's a proxy for money. And just because he says it's money doesn't mean it really is. And again, that's fine. I understand that. But you still have to understand what money is in practice. And so it's important to understand how that system can work, even if you happen to believe that money is gold only or Bitcoin only or whatever it is, something chosen by the market. And you've heard me say before too that I think money is a form of control. We've used the matrix as the example, and we've said money is the original matrix. It's a government created construct built to keep us under control in order to change human beings into a battery. And we've done a whole presentation on this before if you want to watch it. But the reason this is important now, because I think one of the reasons people are so interested in this topic now is because I think a lot of people see that governments around the world have gotten in trouble because of the types of monetary systems that they've run and the amount of debts that they've built up, and they've lived beyond their means, and they haven't been good stewards of capital. And as a result, as problems arise, then individual freedoms start getting lost, and more power gets given to the central authorities. And so there's this battle kind of between the state and the individual. And this, coincides beautifully with the fourth turning concept, and it arises very good with, or it correlates very well with the rise of Bitcoin and other digital currencies, and people trying very hard to have their own form of money that's out of the state's control. Because if they can get control of their own money, then they have control. They have a certain level of sovereignty. And this was detailed very beautifully in a fantastic book called The Sovereign Individual. Now, if you haven't read this book, you should absolutely read this book. I love this book. I love the ideas put forward in this book. I think that might surprise some people, because a lot of times people say, well, Brent, you talk about how great the dollar is and how the United States is so dominant. And, to be clear, the reason I talk about that stuff is it's important to, again, understand reality of how the world actually works. And just because I explain how the world actually works, and I talk about, the dollar and how powerful it is, and the strength of the euro dollar market, that doesn't necessarily mean I advocate for that system. It's a very big difference between analyzing something and advocating for something. I very much like the ideas professed in the Sovereign Individual book. And again, I would encourage you to read it. I don't know that I necessarily agree with where things are headed that the authors of the Sovereign Individual wrote. But basically, there's a whole section in the book regarding money. And it's been a while since I read it, so I might not get all this exactly right. But, and it really goes back to everything we're talking about here. So money as personal, there's 5 things. Money as personal sovereignty, the rise of stateless money, kind of, you could argue that's Bitcoin or gold or some other commodity, the erosion of state power, a shift in sovereignty, from the state to the individual, and then global market for jurisdiction. Essentially, when you go to the personal sovereignty, if control over money is the foundation of independence, it goes back to power and money and how they're inextricable, right? If you have money and you have means, you don't have to rely on anybody else, right? And if you can keep your wealth safe from confiscation, that gives you a level of power that other people might not have, and it gives you a certain level of personal sovereignty. The rise of state money is obviously a big part of this. They argued that a digital cryptographic currency would come into being. They wrote this book prior to Bitcoin, so it was a pretty prescient prediction. Borderless money, and it breaks with the monopoly of the governments. And I would argue, and when Bitcoin first came out, this was like the big thing, is that it was going to be borderless money, and it was going to be anti-state. But then somewhere along the way, they started saying, a lot of the proponents started saying the state was going to adopt it, and that it was a store of value. It wasn't necessarily going to be a medium of exchange. But it does have this element of stateless money. Now, I would argue also the reason the state, whether it's the United States or some other country, the reason that the states haven't really gone after Bitcoin in a large way is because Bitcoin has not threatened their national currencies. If it ever got to the point where Bitcoin seriously threatened a national currency, especially the US dollar, I would expect there would be a big battle. Now, I don't know who would win. I have my suspicions of who would win, but I don't know for sure. But the point is, there would be a big battle. And the reason goes back to what we said at the very beginning. A state that is subservient to another form of money is not truly sovereign. And every state and every person ultimately wants to be sovereign. So again, this gets to the very heart of everything that's going on in the global marketplace right now, especially as we get to number 3 here, the erosion of state power, right? As if and when stateless money weakens the ability of states to function, the states then lose power. And it doesn't even have to be related to stateless money. As a country's currency loses its relevance on the global stage, and as people no longer accept it, a country cannot last if its currency doesn't last. That's just the bottom line. And so, we've seen in other countries around the world who have had currency crises, financial crises, and they ultimately, a lot of times the government itself will fall when that happens. Now, one of the big things from the book was basically the prediction that there would be a shift of sovereignty from the states to individuals, and it's kind of a beautiful idea, and it's a very hopeful prediction. Again, I think this is much harder to actually accomplish than they lay out in the book. But again, it's something to consider. And listen, it's obviously a very worthy goal, in my opinion. As somebody who believes in liberty and freedom and self-sovereignty, it would be hard to argue with this. But I do think the ability to accomplish this is going to be much more difficult than perhaps is said here. But the analogy they use is just as gunpowder leveled feudal power than digital money empowers individuals over states. I don't think we're there yet. Maybe we will at some point, but again, it kind of goes back to the heart of everything we're talking about. And then basically, global market for jurisdiction is, basically, as people become self-sovereign, they're no longer need to stay within, the borders of where they currently live, and they can, move freely around the world, and therefore states will then kind of somewhat recruit them, right? And so, states will basically will show fealty to these wealthy individuals and try to get them to come there because the individuals are actually more powerful than the state. Now, again, I think it's a wonderful book. I'm not sure that it's as easy as they lay it out to be, and this is why this really gets to why I kind of pound the table on the dollar so hard. It's not that I don't. Again, I've just said this. It's not that I don't like the ideas that are put forth in the sovereign individual. It's not that I don't like, the idea of gold mean money. It's not the idea that I don't like, a stateless digital currency such as Bitcoin being the money that the world uses. I would love a free market chosen money. The point I've tried to make as hard as possible that if you are going to have a stateless money, that means you are, by definition, coming into conflict with the state. That is a very dangerous proposition. Now, I'm not saying it's not a worthy proposition, and I'm not saying we shouldn't try for it. I'm just saying it is dangerous, and the state will fight back. And if it is a revolutionary act, and there's really no other way to say it. So if you are going to start a revolution and you are going to storm the castle walls, you better have a good idea of how high the walls are and how thick they are and how strong they are. And the point I have tried very hard to make is that the walls are much higher than you think, they're much thicker than you think, and they're much stronger than you think. And not only that, the state will fight much, much dirtier than you can possibly imagine in order for them to stay sovereign. This is a battle for sovereignty, and the state will not willingly give it away. That's very important to understand that. And this is where we come to stablecoins. I think, in my opinion, that people are completely missing the true value of the stablecoin. At least from the stuff that I have read about it, and from the analysis that I've looked at, and from the many, the commentary, the presentations, I think the true value of it is being overlooked, and I don't think people have a good grasp on how it is the U.S. plans to use this. I think stablecoins are a way that the U.S. is going to build the castle walls higher than they've ever been, and I think this is not just a battle of sovereignty between the state and the individuals. This is a part of the battle of sovereignty on the global stage, one country versus the other. Which country is the actual sovereign? Which country has global seigniorage? Which country is the global hegemon? And I strangely think stablecoins might be one of the most important weapons in that battle. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to write a big report about this, and we're going to do a presentation on this. But to watch the presentation, you're going to have to sign up for our research, because that's where it's going to be at. If you go to research.santiagocapital.com, there's 2 different levels you can sign up on our premium site there. If you sign up for the premium site, then you not only get all of the stuff that we're already doing on the previous premium site, then you'll get the long form written report, and you'll get access to the presentation that we will give. There's also a basic subscription level. And if you sign up for the basic subscription level, then you'll be able to watch the presentation. The written report won't be available, but the subscription or the presentation will be available. So I strongly urge, and this is going to come later in September. So we'll talk about it a little bit more leading up to that, but later in September, we'll do the presentation. We'll send out the report on this. So please, if you get a chance, go over and check us out at researchsantiagocapital.com. And then what I'm going to do now is I promised my niece that I was going to give her a shout out on my podcast this week. So happy birthday, Coco. I'm sorry I can't see you in person to give you a big hug and celebrate your birthday with you. But for anybody, they don't know Coco. Coco's something special. So love you, Coco. Hope you're doing good. Hope you're having a great night. And please, everybody, go and smash that like button. Every like that we get on this podcast is going to be dedicated to Coco. So I hope you have a great night, Coco. Now, we're going to go through just a few charts, and then we're going to wrap it up. Yeah, you can see this. Okay, so we're going to just look at a few charts. So here's the S&P 500. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Many of you already know kind of my belief. I've said it publicly. I'm not going to go back on it because I still believe it. I don't think we're going to get out of Q3 without a meaningful correction. And we've got 4 weeks to go. Now, whether that correction ends up being 6% and fills this first gap right here, whether it's a 10% and it fills this second gap here, or whether it's 17% and it fills this last gap right here, I don't know. Maybe my guess is that it'll be in the 6 to 11% range. It's hard to really see it going there in the next 3 or 4 weeks, but hey, you don't know. And part of the reasoning is I just think it's time. I think everything has gotten overextended. There's a number of different ways we can look at it on a technical basis. We're getting pretty close to support right here. It's still above it. If we look at it from this way, this is the S&P, right? We look at it here. It's already broken through. We can look at it this way, go all the way back here, and we can say it's just right there at support. So again, I just think we're very close. I think the market's gotten ahead of itself. I think it's getting kind of tired, and I think we're due for a correction. Now that's the S&P. If we turn it over and we look at the NASDAQ, kind of a similar thing. It's sitting right here at support. If we go back to the May trend line, if we take it all the way back here to the April low, which I kind of honestly don't think that's the right way to look at it. We could say that it kind of broke the trend, back, at the beginning of August. And if we look at Microsoft, Microsoft, it's kind of really broken down here. It's the relative strength is back down into the, mid 50s or mid 40s. Stochastics have totally collapsed, but the price has come down a lot, but it hasn't really fallen through any support yet. And that's where, as far as the moving averages, is it fell through this support pretty significantly right here. It kind of crashed through that support right there. It's now sitting right at its 50-day moving average. I think by the end of September, and listen, I'm going to do something you're never supposed to do. Number one, you're never supposed to make predictions. And if you do make predictions, you're certainly never supposed to put a time frame on it. But since I've already done it on the overall markets, I think it's very likely that Microsoft tests its 100-day moving average sometime in the next month, and that's about $30 lower from here. I think that would be about a 8 to 10% fall. Let's just look, where would that be? Yeah, 8% or something like that. And it could easily go down to the 200-day moving average. And then I wanted to show you this too. This is the DAX. The DAX, if we take it back to the April lows, it's now, this is a weekly chart. It's now broken its support. But what I think is even more interesting is if we take it all the way back to last year and we look at this and we kind of smooth out the April drawdown and we use the long-term kind of weekly as the trend line, it just broke below that. So I don't think this is just a US thing. I think the whole world got ahead of itself. I think we're due for a correction, and I think it's going to happen sometime in the next 3 or 4 weeks. So anyway, I hope you guys have a great Labor Day weekend, wrap up to your summer, and I hope you're ready for a crazy September, because I think it's coming. Anyway, we'll talk to you again next week. Have a good weekend.